Snow melted in secret places first, but up on the mountain, winter held on with a cold, dead grip. For 3 days, a woman had been walking toward that mountain, and for 3 days, the world had been trying to kill her. Her boots were soaked through, her dress a cage of ice against her skin. Hunger was a dull ache that had long since replaced thought. The men who'd left her behind, the ones who'd been her whole world, they'd called her soft, too much of a burden for the hard road ahead. They said the wagon had no room for her, but she knew the truth. They had no room for a witness. So she walked. Not toward civilization, but away from it. Toward the jagged peaks where only silence and smoke dared to live. She was just about to give up, to lay down in the snow and let the quiet take her, when she saw it. A thin ribbon of wood smoke, coiling up from the trees like a ghost's last breath. A cabin, tucked away at the edge of the world. It could be salvation, or it could be something much, much worse. She stumbled to the edge of the clearing, her body trembling with a fear that had nothing to do with the cold. The sharp crack of an axe split the air. A man stood by a pile of logs. He was bigger than any man she'd ever seen. Broad as a barn door, with hair and beard streaked gray like the winter sky. He moved with a brutal efficiency, the axe rising and falling, each strike a final, definitive statement. He hadn't seen her yet. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What kind of man lives alone this far up a mountain? Then he stopped, and he looked up. His eyes met hers across the clearing, and the world went still. There was no surprise in his gaze, no curiosity. It was the flat, dead-eyed stare of a predator who's just noticed something small and weak wander into his territory. He didn't call out. He didn't move. He just waited, the axe held loose in his hand, a natural extension of his arm. The wind howled, whipping her hair across her face, screaming at her to run. But her legs wouldn't move. Her words, the ones she'd practiced, the ones that were supposed to save her, they were trapped in her throat. She had to speak. Now. Before the courage vanished completely. "Let me stay," she whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. They shivered as they left her mouth. "I'm too fat to love," she said, repeating the cruel words her husband had last thrown at her. "But I can cook." The giant of a man just blinked. Once. Slowly. It was the most terrifyingly calm reaction she could have imagined. Then, without a single word, he turned his back on her and walked to the cabin door. He pulled it open and disappeared inside. He left the door hanging open. Smoke and a sliver of warm light bled out into the dying day. It wasn't an invitation. It didn't feel like one. It felt like a test. Or a trap. But her feet were already moving before her mind could scream no, carrying her across the frozen ground, toward the dark, open doorway. She was walking out of the frying pan and, she suspected, directly into the fire. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. The warmth hit her first. Wood smoke, old pine, and the faint, savory scent of roasted meat. The cabin was one small room. A table, a cot, a shelf with a few tin plates. A heavy rifle rested above the mantel, its barrel gleaming in the firelight. It was a man's space. Hard and practical. There was a thick layer of solitude here, so dense it felt like armor. He was sitting by the fire, his back to her. He hadn't looked at her since she'd stepped inside. He'd set his axe by the door and was now carving a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife. The rhythmic scrape of blade on wood was the only sound. Her body ached. Her stomach twisted into a knot of hunger and fear. But she did the only thing she knew how to do. She began to move. Quietly, like a ghost, she searched the small space. She found flour in a tin canister, a jar of beans, a small paper parcel of salt. Without a word, she set to work, her hands moving with a muscle memory that defied her exhaustion. She was making herself useful. She was making herself necessary. When the simple meal of beans and flatbread was ready, she set a plate on the small table beside him. He didn't thank her. He didn't even look up. He just put down his carving, picked up the plate, and ate with the same silent, focused intensity he'd used to chop wood. She watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. When he finished, he pushed the empty plate away and picked his carving back up. But just before the knife touched wood again, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture so small, so insignificant, it nearly broke her. She turned away quickly, hiding the tears that sprang to her eyes. That tiny nod felt more dangerous than any threat. It was a crack in the armor. That night, she slept on the hard floor by the hearth, wrapped in her own damp shawl. The warmth from the fire was a comfort she hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. Sometime in the deep, dark hours of the night, she woke. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was cold. A shadow was moving in the darkness. It was him. He was standing over her, a heavy wool blanket in his hands. He moved with a strange, silent grace for such a large man. He gently draped the blanket over her, his rough fingers brushing her shoulder for a fraction of a second. He didn't seem to notice her eyes were open, watching him in the faint glow of the dying fire. He then retreated to his chair, not his cot, and sat there, unmoving, a silent sentinel watching over her until the first hint of dawn. He was like a mountain guarding a secret it didn't yet know it had. But as she drifted back to sleep under the weight of the warm blanket, her eyes caught something on the floor, half hidden under his cot. A small, delicate hairpin made of tortoiseshell, the kind a woman from the city might wear. It looked almost brand new, and it definitely didn't belong in a place like this. Days bled into one another, each marked by the same unspoken rhythm. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended his torn shirts. He hunted, he chopped wood, he disappeared into the hills for hours at a time, always returning with fresh game and a deeper silence. They barely spoke. But the silence was changing. It was no longer the empty, terrifying void of that first day. It was becoming something else. A shared space. A strange, fragile peace. One afternoon, she laughed. It was a small, rusty sound, pulled from her by a squirrel's antics outside the window. The sound startled them both. It echoed in the small cabin, a foreign noise in a world of grunts and scraping knives. He didn't smile, but his carving knife paused for a long moment, and his eyes rested on her for a heartbeat longer than usual. As the thaw finally reached the high country, the snow retreated, leaving behind mud and the first stubborn wildflowers. She started to hum as she worked, old tunes from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Sometimes she'd catch him on the porch, pretending to mend a trap, but really just listening. A strange gentleness was seeping into the cracks of their hard, silent world. But that kind of peace, she knew, never lasts. The men from town started riding up the ridge. They weren't the men who had abandoned her, but they had the same cruel eyes, the same mocking laughter that carried on the wind. "Looks like the mountain bear found himself a cook," one of them yelled one afternoon, his voice dripping with venom. "Guess he got tired of his own company." Their words were like poison darts, finding their way through the log walls. She was scrubbing the floor when she heard them, and her hands froze in the bucket of soapy water. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her. She was a burden, a joke. She was nothing more than what they said she was. That night, she worked herself to the bone. She baked bread, scoured the pots until they shone, and mended a tear in his coat with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She had to prove her worth. She had to earn the roof over her head. When he came in, his boots caked in mud, she spoke without turning from the hearth. "They're laughing," she said, her voice tight. "They say you only keep me out of pity." The room went dead silent. She could feel his eyes on her back. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then she heard him move, a soft rustle of fabric, the sound of something being placed on the table behind her. When she finally turned, a new shawl lay there. Not fine and delicate, but made of thick, coarse wool, hand-stitched and strong. It smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke. Of him. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just grumbled, his voice rougher than usual. "Wind's colder up here than folks think." She reached out and touched the shawl. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. That night, wrapped in its warmth, she didn't dream of the men who left her to die. She dreamed of the firelight dancing on the mountain man's rough, scarred hands. The next morning, she found a small wooden carving on her plate next to her bread. It was a bird, its wings spread wide as if about to take flight. It was crude, the lines uneven, but it was alive. He was already gone, hunting in the hills. She traced the lines of the wooden bird with her finger, and for the first time in a very long time, she smiled a real smile, with no shame attached. But that afternoon, while gathering firewood, she stumbled. Her hand shot out to brace herself against a pile of old, discarded lumber near the woodpile. A plank shifted, revealing a small, dark space beneath. Curiosity got the better of her. She pulled the wood away and peered into the darkness. Inside was a small, rotting wooden box. Her heart pounded as she lifted the heavy lid. It wasn't filled with treasure. It was filled with carvings. Dozens of them. All of the same thing. A woman's face. A beautiful woman, with long hair and a sad smile. And every single carving had its eyes scratched out. Spring deepened. The world came alive with color and sound. And so did she. She started telling him pieces of her story. She told him about her husband, Jedediah, and the wagon train. She told him how he'd said she was too slow, too soft for the life they were chasing. How he'd left her with nothing but the clothes on her back on the side of a dusty trail. She told him how she'd followed them until her feet bled, then turned toward the mountains because she was too stubborn to die. Boone, as she had learned his name was, listened in his usual silence, his eyes fixed on the fire, his hands never stilling from their carving. When she finally finished, her voice choked with the remembered shame. She whispered, "I can cook, sir. That's all I'm good for." He finally looked at her. His eyes, usually as hard and gray as river stones, held something different. A flicker of something. "That's plenty," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. Just 2 words, but they sank into her soul, anchoring her in a way no promise or sweet word ever had. They didn't fix the broken pieces inside her, but they gave her a place to set them down. The air in the cabin shifted after that. The distance between them didn't shrink, but it softened. She started noticing things. How he always left the best piece of meat for her. How he chopped twice as much firewood as they needed, as if the physical labor could quiet the storm inside him. Sometimes, when she was hanging laundry, she'd feel his eyes on her. But when she'd turn, he'd be looking at the clouds, his expression unreadable. But the image of those scratched-out carvings haunted her. Who was that woman? And what had she done to earn such violent, silent hatred? One evening, she caught her reflection in the dark surface of the stew kettle. Her face was still round, her arms still full, but her eyes were different. Steadier. She wasn't the same woman who had stumbled out of the woods, begging for her life. She was no longer waiting for someone to see her. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind moaned outside, she found her courage. "Boone," she asked, her voice quiet but clear, "why did you let me stay that first day?" He didn't look up from his carving. The knife moved in slow, deliberate strokes. "Didn't let you," he grunted. "You just did." It wasn't unkind. It was just a fact. She had stayed. She had survived. A faint smile touched her lips. She understood more than his words said. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was warm, comfortable, like good soil waiting for a seed. Later, long after his breathing had deepened into the slow rhythm of sleep, She lay awake by the hearth. The fire cast his shadow on the wall, a giant bent and twisted by years of solitude. She thought about the hairpin. She thought about the carvings. Had anyone ever dared to touch his loneliness? He had touched hers without even trying. "I'll earn my keep, sir," she whispered into the darkness, not expecting an answer. "Even if it takes forever." From the shadows of his chair came a quiet reply, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "You already did." Her heart gave a painful lurch. The words unlocked a door inside her she thought had been sealed forever. Hope, fragile and terrifying, began to seep in. She turned to the window, where the first pale light of dawn was touching the ridge. The world was beginning again. And that's when she heard it. A sound from her old life. A sound she never wanted to hear again. Faint at first, but growing closer. The rhythmic thud of hoofbeats coming up the mountain from the valley below. Her body went rigid. Her breath caught in her throat. The past was riding toward them. And it was coming fast. Boone heard it too. In an instant, he was awake. The quiet, carving man was gone. In his place was something else. Something dangerous. He didn't sit up. He uncoiled from the chair like a predator, his face a mask of stone. He moved to the door, grabbing the heavy rifle from the mantel as he passed. She scrambled to her feet, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. That sound. The sound of her husband's horse. It had once meant safety. Now it was the sound of her own damnation. A rider emerged from the morning mist, a man in a worn coat, his hat pulled low. But she didn't need to see his face. She knew the cruel set of his shoulders, the arrogant way he sat in the saddle. Jedediah, her husband, her. He reined his horse to a stop at the edge of the clearing, his eyes taking in the small cabin, the smoke rising from the chimney, and finally, her, standing frozen in the doorway. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Well, now," he called out, his voice slick with false charm. "If it ain't my runaway cook. I thought the wolves would have had you for supper by now." He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling a death knell in the quiet morning. "But it looks like you found a big old bear to keep you warm instead." Boone stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loose at his side. He was a mountain of a man, his silence more threatening than any shout. The air crackled with a tension so thick she could barely breathe. Jed's smirk faltered for a second when he saw the sheer size of Boone, but he recovered quickly. "She's my wife," he spat, his eyes darting between them. "Law says she belongs to me. Ain't your business if she got a bit lost." She flinched, the old shame washing over her. She was property, a lost dog to be reclaimed. But then Boone spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of the mountain itself. "She don't belong to nobody." There was something in that voice, a finality, a promise of violence that made Jed take an involuntary step back. He wasn't used to being challenged. He was a bully who preyed on the weak, and Boone was anything but weak. Jed spat on the ground, his eyes burning with hatred. He looked at her, then back at Boone. "Keep her, then," he sneered, backing toward his horse. "You'll find out soon enough what kind of trouble you've brought to your door." He swung himself into the saddle, his face twisted in a vicious scowl. "She's got something of mine," he yelled, "and I'll be back for it." With a final curse, he wheeled his horse around and galloped back down the mountain, disappearing into the mist as quickly as he'd appeared. When the sound of his hoofbeats faded, only the whisper of the wind was left. She collapsed onto the porch steps, her body shaking uncontrollably. Boone stood over her for a long moment, the rifle still in his hand. Finally he asked, his voice rough, "You all right?" She could only nod, tears streaming down her face. "He left me to die," she whispered. "Why did he come back?" Boone knelt beside her, his presence a solid, comforting weight. He looked her straight in the eye. "He didn't come back for you," he said, his voice low and certain. "He reminded you of what he lost. That's all." His hand hovered near her shoulder, a gesture of comfort he couldn't quite bring himself to complete. But it was enough. That night, neither of them slept. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. Boone sat in his chair by the door, the rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the window. He knew men like Jed. They didn't just leave. They circled, like vultures, waiting for the right moment to strike. Morning brought a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The first drops of rain began to fall, whispering against the roof. The world outside seemed to be weeping. By noon, the whisper had become a roar. Rain lashed the cabin, and the small creek in the clearing swelled into a raging, muddy torrent. She ran outside, trying to save the laundry she'd hung on the line. The wind tore at her, plastering her skirts to her legs. Boone followed her out, shouting over the howl of the storm. "Leave it! It's not worth it!" "I can't!" she screamed back, her fingers numb as she fumbled with the knots. "It's all we have!" Just then, a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a brilliant, terrifying flash. In that split second, he saw her. Not as a burden, not as a cook, but as a warrior, standing defiant against the rage of the storm. He reached her in 2 long strides, his hand closing around hers. He pulled her away from the clothesline just as a massive pine tree on the creek bank gave way with a sickening crack, crashing down exactly where she had been standing, taking the fence and all the laundry with it into the churning water. They stumbled back inside, soaked and breathless. She leaned against the wall, her body trembling with cold and the aftershock of her near-death experience. He stood so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the scent of rain and pine on his clothes. "Why do you fight so hard?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a truth she had never spoken aloud. "Because I've always had to." For a long, silent moment, he just stared at her. Then, slowly, he reached out and brushed a wet strand of hair from her face. His touch was surprisingly gentle. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if her skin had burned him. The storm raged all night. The floodwaters rose, clawing at the cabin's foundation. Inside, they were trapped in a small pocket of warmth and light, an island in a world of violent chaos. She sat by the fire, mending a tear in his sleeve, her fingers moving with a slow, steady determination. "You don't have to fix everything," he said from the shadows. "I know," she replied, not looking up. "But if I stop moving, I'll start to remember." "Remember what?" Her hands stilled. She finally looked at him, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "How it feels to be unwanted." A raw, unfamiliar emotion flickered in his eyes. "You're wanted here," he said, the words sounding like they'd been torn from him. She gave a small, sad smile and looked back down at her sewing. "You don't mean that," she whispered. He didn't answer. He just stood up, walked to the door, and stepped out into the raging storm, as if the rain and wind could say the things he couldn't. By dawn, the storm had broken. A thick mist hung over the valley, muffling the world in a beautiful, eerie silence. She found him outside, splitting wood that was still dripping wet. He'd clearly been out there all night. She approached him with a towel. "You'll catch your death," she said softly. He stopped, leaned the axe against the woodpile, and finally looked at her. The exhaustion on his face couldn't hide the intensity in his eyes. "You shouldn't have had to beg to stay," he said, his voice raw. "Not here, not anywhere." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "You belong where you're seen," he said gruffly, turning back to his work. "Don't you ever forget that." Later that day, she found a folded piece of paper on the table. It was his handwriting, rough and uneven. It just said, I see you. She sank into a chair, her throat tight, and traced the letters with a trembling finger. But the peace was fragile. It came apart that evening in a shower of sparks and smoke. The chimney, weakened by the storm, caught fire. A crackle, a roar, and then thick, black smoke was pouring through the roof. "Boone!" she screamed, grabbing a bucket of water. But the flames were climbing with a terrifying speed, licking at the dry timber of the roof. He burst in, his face a mask of grim determination. He didn't even look at the fire. He wrapped his coat around her and shoved her toward the door. "Get out!" he roared. Outside, in the orange, flickering twilight, she watched in horror as he beat at the flames with a heavy blanket, refusing to give up, even as pieces of the burning roof began to fall around him. "Leave it!" she shrieked. "It's not worth it! Let it burn!" He ignored her, fighting the blaze with a primal fury. When the last ember finally died, the cabin was a ruin, half burned and black, smoke curling into the darkening sky. He turned to face her, soot on his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She just stared at him, her body shaking. "You should have let it burn," she whispered, tears cutting clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "I'm not worth that." His eyes flashed in the dying light, a look of fierce, protective anger. "You don't get to say that anymore." "Why not?" she sobbed. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat still radiating from him. His hand came up, hovering near her cheek but not touching. "Because I seen you fight a storm that would have broken most men. Because you feed a lonely man and still find it in you to smile. Because you stayed." "You think that makes me strong?" she asked, her voice breaking. He gave a single solemn nod. "Stronger than me." The world around them was ash and ruin, but in that moment, something new was being forged. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a second before she took his. His rough, calloused fingers closed around hers, a silent, binding promise. They stood there together, in the smoky twilight, as the last of the flames died. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. But Jedediah's threat still hung in the air. "She's got something of mine." And as they stood in the ruins of their shelter, she finally understood what he meant. It wasn't her. It was something she had. Something she'd taken. Something he was willing to kill for. And as she looked at Boone, at this man who had fought a fire for her, she realized with a sickening lurch that she had brought Jed's war right to his doorstep. He hadn't just saved her from the wilderness. He had unknowingly offered sanctuary to a woman on the run from a monster. And that monster was coming back. They worked together to salvage what they could from the burned-out shell of the cabin. It wasn't much. A few pots, some blankets that smelled of smoke, the rifle. As she was pulling a scorched tin box from the ashes of a corner, something fell out. It was a small, leather-bound book, a journal. She opened it. The handwriting was neat, feminine. It wasn't his. It was a woman's journal. The woman from the carvings. Her name was Annabelle, and she had been Boone's wife. She read, her horror growing with every page. Annabelle hadn't left him. She hadn't died of sickness. She had been murdered. The journal entries spoke of a crew of men who had come to the mountain, led by a charming but ruthless man, looking for a place to lie low after a bank robbery. They'd terrorized her and Boone, and the leader of that crew. His name was Jedediah. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't a coincidence. Her husband, the man who had abandoned her, was the same man who had destroyed Boone's life. He hadn't just stumbled upon this mountain. He knew exactly where he was going. He was coming back to the scene of his first crime. She looked up at Boone, who was staring into the distance, his face etched with a grief so profound it stole her breath. He wasn't just a quiet mountain man. He was a man hollowed out by loss, living in the graveyard of his own life, waiting for a ghost to return. And she had led that ghost right back to him. "Boone," she said, her voice trembling as she held out the journal. We need to talk. That night, under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars, the whole story came out. He told her how Jed's gang had used their cabin, taken their food, and how Annabelle had stood up to them. He told her how Jed had laughed as he couldn't finish the sentence. He just pointed to a small, unmarked patch of ground near the creek. Annabelle's grave. The one the flood had nearly uncovered. He'd hunted them. One by one. The carvings with the scratched-out eyes weren't of his wife. They were of the men he had tracked down and brought to his own brutal form of justice. All except one. Jedediah. The leader. The one who got away. And now she understood what Jed was coming back for. It wasn't just her. Annabelle's journal mentioned the stolen bank money. Jed's crew had buried it somewhere on the mountain before they fled. And Jed, a man consumed by greed, believed she knew where it was. "I have to leave," she said, the words tasting like ash. "He'll kill you to get to me." "No," Boone said, his voice a low growl. "This ends here, where it started." They had no cabin, no shelter. They were exposed. They spent the next 2 days setting traps, fortifying the rock outcroppings near the clearing. Boone taught her how to load and fire the rifle, his hand steady on hers. The woman who had once thought herself too soft was now preparing for war. They didn't have to wait long. On the 3rd morning, they appeared. Jedediah and 2 other men, their faces hard and cruel. They rode into the clearing slowly, confidently, like they owned the place. "I told you I'd be back!" Jed yelled, his eyes scanning the ruins of the cabin. "Now, you're gonna give me my money, and I might just let the big man live." From their hiding spot behind a jumble of boulders, Boone raised his rifle. "You ain't getting nothing but a shallow grave," he called back. The first shot cracked through the morning air, and the mountain became a battlefield. Gun smoke filled the clearing. Shots echoed off the peaks. Jed's men were good, but Boone was better. He moved with a deadly purpose, a force of nature fueled by years of pent-up rage and grief. He took one man down, then the other, until only Jedediah was left. Jed, seeing he was outmatched, did the one thing he was good at. He ran, but not down the mountain. He scrambled up the rocks, toward the high cliffs. He knew this mountain. He knew a place to hide. "Stay here," Boone ordered her, and took off after him, a hunter closing in on his prey. She waited, every second an eternity. Then she heard a scream, a cry of pain. It was Boone. Without a second thought, she grabbed the axe from where it leaned against a tree and ran. She followed the sounds of the struggle up the rocky path. She found them on a narrow ledge overlooking a steep drop. Boone was on the ground, clutching a bleeding wound in his leg. Jed stood over him, a bloody knife in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Should have stayed dead, old man," Jed spat, raising the knife for the final blow. "No!" she screamed. Jed turned, surprised to see her. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in recognition. It was a look that confirmed everything. He hadn't just found her by chance. He'd been looking for her, and he thought she had his map. That momentary distraction was all Boone needed. He lunged, grabbing Jed's leg and pulling him off balance. They tumbled together on the narrow ledge, a desperate, violent struggle between 2 men bound by a history of blood and loss. She saw her chance. She raised the axe, the weight of it both strange and familiar in her hands. She was not the woman who had begged for her life. She was the woman who had fought a storm, who had survived the wilderness, who had been seen and valued. Jed finally overpowered the wounded Boone, pushing him away and raising the knife high. As he brought it down, she swung the axe with all her strength. Not at him, but at the crumbling rock face right beside him. The edge of the ledge, weakened by years of ice and rain, gave way with a deafening crack. Jed's eyes went wide with terror as the ground beneath his feet disappeared. He teetered for a moment on the brink, his arms flailing, and then, with a final desperate scream, he fell into the abyss. Silence descended on the mountain. She dropped the axe and rushed to Boone's side. His leg was bad, but he was alive. She tore a strip from her dress and tied a tourniquet, her hands moving with a newfound confidence. "It's over," she whispered, helping him to his feet. He leaned on her, his arm draped over her shoulder. "You saved me," he said, his voice full of a weary awe. "No," she said, looking out at the vast, empty sky where Jedediah had fallen. "We saved each other." They made their way back down to the clearing. The bodies of Jed's men lay where they had fallen. The sheriff and his deputies from town, alerted by the sound of the gunfight, arrived an hour later. They took their statements, hauled away the bodies, and confirmed that Boone, the man they had long suspected of being a quiet hermit, was in fact the hero of the day. The story of the lost bank money was finally put to rest, and so were the ghosts of the mountain. They rebuilt, not the same cabin, but a smaller, stronger one. They built it together, log by log. The silence between them was gone, replaced by the easy rhythm of shared work, of quiet conversation, of laughter that was no longer shy or startled. One evening, as the sun set, painting the peaks in shades of orange and purple, they sat on the porch of their new home. He was carving again. She leaned over to see what it was. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a scratched-out face. It was two figures, a large man and a smaller woman, standing side by side. He looked at her, his eyes clear and full of a quiet, steady warmth that chased away the last of the shadows. "I see you," he said. She smiled and took his rough, scarred hand in hers. "I see you too," she replied. They had both been left for dead, abandoned by a cruel world. But here, on this mountain of ruin and redemption, they had found something they never expected. They had found a place to belong. They had found home. If you enjoyed this story of survival and unexpected justice, hit that subscribe button, because there are always more strange, dark, and mysterious tales waiting to be told.